The crack of a fist against bone echoed through the Dusty Rose Saloon in Abilene, Kansas, and Sarah Mitchell knew she had just sealed her fate. But watching the burly ranch hand crumple to the floor made every consequence worth it. It was August 1877, and the heat pressed down on the cattle town like a heavy blanket. But inside the saloon, the temperature had nothing to do with the weather. Sarah's knuckles throbbed as she stood protectively in front of Mary Chen, a young Chinese laundress who had been cornered by 3 drunk cattlemen. The largest of them, a brute named Brock Holloway, had grabbed Mary's arm and made suggestions that would make a devil blush. When Mary tried to pull away, he had slapped her hard enough to split her lip. That was when Sarah had stepped in and her punch had sent Holloway sprawling. The saloon fell silent. Every eye turned toward them. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her chin high, her green eyes blazing with righteous fury. She was 22 years old, the daughter of a failed shopkeeper who had died of consumption 2 winters back, leaving her to fend for herself. She worked as a seamstress, her fingers nimble with needle and thread, but her spirit was anything but delicate. "You crazy woman!" Holloway roared, blood streaming from his nose as he staggered to his feet. His companions moved to flank him, their faces twisted with anger and alcohol. "You will pay for that!" Before Sarah could respond, the saloon doors swung open with such force they banged against the walls. A tall figure stepped through, silhouetted against the afternoon sun. As he moved into the lamplight, Sarah saw a man in his mid-20s with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, sun-bronzed skin, and eyes the color of a winter sky. He wore dusty trail clothes and a gun belt slung low on his hips, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was capable of. "That is enough," the stranger said, his voice low and steady but carrying an unmistakable authority. He positioned himself between Sarah and the 3 men, his hand resting casually near his revolver. The lady did what any decent person should do. "You lay hands on that girl first, Holloway. I saw it through the window." "This is none of your concern, Dalton," Holloway snarled. Though Sarah noticed, he took a step back. "That Chinese girl is nothing, and this woman assaulted me. I saw a coward strike a defenseless woman, and I saw someone with courage stop him," the man called Dalton replied. His eyes never left Holloway's face, but Sarah felt the weight of his protection like a shield. "Now you and your friends are going to walk out of here peacefully, or we are going to have a different kind of conversation." The tension stretched like a rope about to snap. Then Holloway spat blood on the sawdust floor and jerked his head toward his companions. "This is not over," he growled, but he turned and shoved his way toward the door. His friends followed, casting dark looks over their shoulders. The moment they were gone, the saloon erupted in nervous chatter. Sarah's legs suddenly felt weak, and she gripped the edge of a table to steady herself. Mary Chen clung to her other arm, trembling and weeping soft thanks in a mixture of English and Chinese. The stranger turned to face them fully, and Sarah found herself looking into those remarkable eyes. Up close, she could see the fine lines at their corners, weathered from squinting at distant horizons, and the strength in his jaw. He was handsome in a rugged way that made her stomach flutter unexpectedly. "Are you both all right?" he asked, his voice gentler now. Sarah nodded, finding her voice. "We are fine, thanks to you. That was brave of you to stand up to them." A slight smile tugged at his lips. "I could say the same about you, miss. That was quite a punch." Heat rose to her cheeks, though whether from embarrassment or something else she could not say. "I could not just stand by and watch." "No, I do not imagine you could." He extended his hand. "Nathaniel Dalton, most folks call me Nate." She placed her hand in his, feeling the calluses that spoke of hard work and long rides. His grip was firm but careful, as though he was conscious of his own strength. "Sarah Mitchell, and this is Mary Chen." Mary bowed her head shyly, murmuring her thanks again. Sarah could see the girl was still shaken, and she wanted to get her home safely. But before she could excuse herself, the saloon owner, a portly man named Henderson, bustled over with a face red as a ripe tomato. "Miss Mitchell, you need to leave," he said urgently, wringing his hands. "Holloway works for Cyrus Brennan, one of the biggest ranchers in the county. When he reports this to Brennan, there will be trouble. You should not have gotten involved." Sarah's temper flared again. He was attacking her. What was I supposed to do? Henderson shook his head miserably. "I understand, truly I do, but Brennan has the sheriff in his pocket. There will be consequences." Nate stepped forward, his expression hardening. "Then perhaps it is time someone stood up to Brennan and his thugs." "Easy to say when you were just passing through," Henderson muttered, though there was no real accusation in his tone, only weariness. Something flickered across Nate's face, but before he could respond, Sarah spoke up. "I should get Mary home." She turned to the cowboy, meeting his eyes. "Thank you again, Mr. Dalton. I am in your debt." "Nate," he corrected, "and you are not in my debt. You did the right thing." He hesitated, then added, "May I walk you ladies home? Those men might be waiting outside." Sarah wanted to refuse on principle. She had been taking care of herself for 2 years now and did not need a man's protection. But she had Mary to think about, and the girl was already terrified. She swallowed her pride and nodded. "That would be kind of you." They stepped out into the blazing afternoon sun. The main street of Abilene stretched before them, wide and dusty, lined with false-fronted buildings that promised more grandeur than they delivered. Horses dozed at hitching posts, and a few townspeople went about their business, eyeing the trio with curiosity. Sarah scanned the street, but saw no sign of Holloway or his friends. As they walked toward the small boarding house where Mary lived with several other Chinese workers, Nate fell into step beside Sarah while Mary walked slightly ahead, still dabbing at her split lip with a handkerchief Sarah had given her. "You are not from Abilene," Sarah observed, partly to break the silence, and partly because she was genuinely curious about this man who had appeared like some hero from a dime novel. "No," Nate agreed. "I have been working as a ranch hand down in Texas, but I'm heading north to Montana Territory. My brother has land up there, and he has asked me to join him." "That is a long journey." "It is, but sometimes a man needs a fresh start." There was something in his voice, a shadow of old pain, that made Sarah want to ask more. But she barely knew him, and it was not her place to pry. They reached the boarding house, a tired structure that leaned slightly to one side. Mary turned to them, her dark eyes swimming with gratitude and fear. "Thank you, Miss Sarah. Thank you, sir. I am so sorry for the trouble." Sarah took the girl's hand. "You have nothing to apologize for, Mary. None of this was your fault. You stay inside tomorrow, all right, until things settle down." Mary nodded and disappeared through the door. Sarah watched her go, worry gnawing at her stomach. Henderson's warning echoed in her mind. She had made powerful enemies today. As if reading her thoughts, Nate said quietly, "He was right, you know. Brennan will not let this go." Sarah turned to him, squaring her shoulders. "Then he does not. I will not apologize for doing what was right." Admiration flickered in his eyes. "You have a lot of courage, Sarah Mitchell." "Or a lot of foolishness, depending on who you ask." She managed a wry smile. "My mother used to say my sense of justice would get me into trouble one day. I suppose she was right." "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was. She died when I was 16. My father followed her 6 years later." Sarah was not sure why she was sharing this with a stranger, but something about Nate invited confidence. Perhaps it was the genuine interest in his eyes, or the way he listened as though her words truly mattered. "I am sorry for your loss," Nate said simply. "It is hard to lose family." They stood there in the street, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Sarah knew she should go home, get back to the dress she had been working on, prepare for whatever storm was coming. But she found herself reluctant to say goodbye to this man who had stepped in when she needed help. "Where are you staying?" she heard herself ask. "The hotel across from the livery, nothing fancy, but it is a bed and a roof." "And when do you leave for Montana?" I was planning to head out tomorrow. He paused, studying her face with those sharp blue eyes. But I might delay a day or two, just to make sure there is no trouble. Sarah's pride bristled. I do not need a protector, Mr. Dalton. Nate, he said again, and this time his smile reached his eyes, transforming his face from merely handsome to something that made her breath catch. And I know you do not. You made that abundantly clear with your right hook. But sometimes having someone watch your back is not about need. It is about not being alone. The simple truth of his words struck something deep in Sarah's chest. She had been alone for so long, carrying every burden by herself, facing every challenge with no one to lean on. The idea that someone might choose to stand beside her, not because she was weak, but simply because he wanted to, was almost overwhelming. I should go, she managed, her voice not quite steady. I have work to finish. May I call on you tomorrow? Nate asked, just to make sure everything's all right. Sarah knew she should say no. This man was passing through, heading to a new life hundreds of miles away. There was no point in letting him into her world even temporarily. But when she opened her mouth, what came out was, I live above the millinery shop on 3rd Street. The blue door on the side leads to my rooms. His smile widened. I will see you tomorrow then, Miss Mitchell. Sarah, she said, echoing his own insistence, what if I am to call you Nate, you should call me Sarah. Tomorrow, Sarah. She walked away, feeling his eyes on her back until she turned the corner. Only then did she allow herself to release the breath she had been holding. Her hands were shaking and she clasped them together. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at her the way Nate Dalton had, with interest and respect, and something else she was afraid to name. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay in her small bed, listening to the sounds of Abilene settling into darkness, and replayed every moment of the afternoon. The crack of her fist against Holloway's jaw, the weight of Mary's gratitude, the way Nate had stepped through those doors like an answer to a prayer she had not known she was praying. She touched her knuckles, which were bruised and swollen, and smiled despite herself. The next morning arrived with the kind of oppressive heat that promised a scorching day. Sarah rose early, washed, and dressed in her simplest calico dress. She had 3 orders to finish by week's end, and she needed to focus, but her hands trembled as she threaded her needle, and she kept glancing at the window as though expecting trouble to arrive at any moment. It did, but not in the form she expected. Around mid-morning, there was a sharp knock at her door. Sarah set aside her sewing and opened it to find Sheriff Tom Bradshaw standing on her threshold, his star gleaming dully in the harsh light. He was a middle-aged man with a soft belly and eyes that never quite met yours directly. Miss Mitchell, he said, his tone formal but not unkind. I need you to come down to my office. Her stomach dropped. What is this about, Sheriff? You know what it is about. Brock Holloway has filed a complaint against you for assault. You need to answer to the charge. Sarah's mind raced. She had known there would be consequences, but she had hoped for more time. I was defending someone, Sheriff. Holloway struck a young woman first. I only intervened to protect her. Bradshaw shifted uncomfortably. That may be, but Holloway says it differently. You need to come make a statement. Am I under arrest? Not yet. But if you do not come willingly, that could change. Sarah lifted her chin. Then I will come. Let me get my bonnet. She followed the sheriff through the streets, acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. News traveled fast in a town like Abilene, and by now everyone knew about the incident at the Dusty Rose. Some faces showed sympathy, others judgment. Sarah ignored them all, focusing on keeping her head high and her steps steady. The sheriff's office was a small, stuffy room with a desk, a few chairs, and a barred door leading to 2 cells in the back. Holloway was there, his nose swollen and bruised, along with a tall, silver-haired man in expensive clothes whom Sarah recognized immediately as Cyrus Brennan. Her heart sank. Brennan looked her up and down with cold eyes. This is the woman? Yes, sir, Holloway said eagerly. She attacked me without provocation. That is a lie, Sarah shot back, her temper flaring. You struck Mary Chen first. I saw it with my own eyes, as did everyone in that saloon. A Chinese girl? Brennan's lip curled. You assaulted one of my best men over a Chinese girl? I stopped him from hurting an innocent person, Sarah corrected, her voice ringing with conviction, and I would do it again. Brennan's expression hardened. You have made a grave mistake, Miss Mitchell. In this county, people know better than to interfere with my operations or my men. Sheriff Bradshaw, I want this woman charged and held until a judge can hear the case. Bradshaw looked distinctly uncomfortable. Mr. Brennan, perhaps we could settle this another way. Miss Mitchell is a respectable woman, a seamstress. She has no history of trouble. Until yesterday, Brennan snapped. I want the full weight of the law brought to bear on her as an example. No one, especially not some spinster seamstress, interferes with my people. The words stung, but Sarah refused to let Brennan see her flinch. She met his gaze steadily, even as fear coiled in her belly. A trial could mean jail time, or worse, a heavy fine she could never afford to pay. The door swung open, and Nate Dalton strode in. Relief flooded through Sarah so powerfully her knees nearly buckled. He took in the scene with one sweeping glance, his jaw tightening as he looked at Brennan and Holloway. Sheriff Bradshaw, he said calmly, I am glad I caught you. I need to make a statement about what happened at the Dusty Rose yesterday. Brennan turned, his eyes narrowing. Who are you? Nathaniel Dalton. I witnessed the entire incident. Nate walked further into the room, positioning himself near Sarah in a subtle show of solidarity. I saw Brock Holloway strike a young woman named Mary Chen. When she tried to get away, he grabbed her and made threats. Miss Mitchell intervened to protect her. She acted in defense of another person. Any court would call that justified. Your testimony was not requested, Schroer, Brennan said coldly. But it is relevant, Nate countered. His voice remained level, but there was steel beneath the calm exterior. The law says a citizen can use reasonable force to defend another from harm. That is exactly what Miss Mitchell did. If you charge her, I will testify to that fact in any court. Holloway stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. He is lying. He did not see anything. I saw everything, Nate said, turning his gaze on the ranch hand. I saw you corner that girl. I saw you strike her. I saw Miss Mitchell stop you from doing worse, and I am willing to swear to all of it under oath. Sheriff Bradshaw looked between Nate and Brennan, clearly torn. Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes. If Nate testified, it would complicate things. A drifting cowboy's word might not count for much, but it would be enough to make the case messy, especially if other witnesses from the saloon came forward. Brennan seemed to reach the same conclusion. His face darkened with fury, but he was too smart to push a losing hand. This is not over, he said quietly, dangerously. Not by a long shot. He turned to Sarah. You have made an enemy today, Miss Mitchell. You will come to regret your foolish heroics. I doubt that, Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Brennan stormed out, Holloway hurrying after him like a whipped dog. The tension in the room eased slightly, but Sarah could see Bradshaw was still troubled. Miss Mitchell, the sheriff said heavily, I'm going to let this go for now, but you need to be careful. Brennan is not a man to cross, and he has a long memory. I understand, Sheriff. Thank you. Outside, the morning sun was blinding after the dimness of the office. Sarah stood on the wooden sidewalk, blinking, trying to process everything that had just happened. Nate stood beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. You did not have to do that, she said quietly. Yes, I did. He turned to face her, and the intensity in his eyes made her pulse quicken. You did what honor demanded, Sarah. The least I could do was tell the truth about it. He said he would testify she had done what honor demanded, she heard someone whisper as they passed by. The words would spread through town, she knew. Some would admire her, others would think her a fool. But standing there with Nate beside her, she found she did not care as much as she thought she would. You were leaving for Montana today, Sarah said, a question in her voice. Nate was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. Then he looked back at her, and something had shifted in his expression, something determined and sure. I was, but that was before. Before what? Before I met a woman brave enough to take on 3 drunk cattlemen to protect someone weaker. Before I met someone who would face down Cyrus Brennan without flinching. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. Before I met you, Sarah. Her breath caught in her throat. You do not even know me. Then let me. The simple words hung between them, full of possibility and promise. Let me stay a while longer. Let me get to know the woman who punches like a prize fighter and has the heart of a lion. Sarah knew she should send him on his way. He had a future waiting in Montana, a new life, a fresh start. She had nothing to offer but trouble and a small seamstress business in a dusty Kansas town. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw something she had not seen in a very long time. Hope. I cannot ask you to give up your plans, she said weakly. You are not asking. I am choosing. Nate smiled, and the warmth of it seemed to push back the heat and the worry and the fear. My brother will wait. Montana's not going anywhere. But this right here, right now, this feels important. You feel important. No one had called Sarah important in longer than she could remember. She had been useful, necessary, capable, but never important. The word settled into her chest like a seed taking root. I have to check on Mary, she said, her mind already racing ahead. I need to make sure she is all right, that she knows Brennan is angry. I will come with you. They walked together through Abilene streets, and Sarah found herself acutely aware of Nate beside her. He matched his pace to hers. His long strides shortened so she did not have to rush. When they passed a rough-looking group of men, he subtly positioned himself between her and them. It was not overbearing or presumptuous, just the natural protectiveness of a good man. At the boarding house, they found Mary huddled in her small room, her few possessions already packed. I am leaving, she told Sarah, tears streaming down her face. The other workers say Brennan will cause trouble for all of us if I stay. I am going to San Francisco where my cousin lives. There are more Chinese there. I will be safer. Sarah's heart ached. Mary, you should not have to run. This is not your fault. Maybe not, but this is the way things are. Mary managed a tremulous smile. You were so kind to help me, Miss Sarah. I will never forget it, but I must go. There was nothing Sarah could say to change her mind, and in truth she feared Mary was right. The girl would be safer far from Brennan's reach. They said their goodbyes, and Sarah pressed what little money she could spare into Mary's hand for the journey. As they left the boarding house, Sarah felt the weight of injustice pressing down on her shoulders. It is not right, she said fiercely. She did nothing wrong, and now she has to leave her home, her job, everything. No, it is not right, Nate agreed, but you gave her a chance to escape. You stood up for her when no one else would. That matters, Sarah. Maybe you cannot change the whole world, but you changed her world. They walked back toward Sarah's rooms in silence, both lost in thought. When they reached the blue door, Sarah turned to Nate, suddenly uncertain. The events of the past day had thrown them together, but now, in the ordinary light of late morning, she felt the strangeness of the situation. This man was essentially a stranger, yet she felt more connected to him than to people she had known for years. Would you like to come up for some coffee? The invitation was out before she could second-guess herself. It is not much, but it is the least I can offer after everything you have done. Nate's smile was gentle. I would like that very much. Her rooms were small but tidy, a combination of living space and workroom. Dress forms stood like silent sentinels in one corner, draped with half-finished garments. Her sewing table was covered with fabric scraps and spools of thread, a small stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed behind a curtain completed the space. It was humble, but it was hers, and Sarah had made it as comfortable as her limited means allowed. She busied herself making coffee, grateful for something to do with her hands. Nate stood by the window looking out at the street below, giving her space but filling the room with his presence nonetheless. "You have a good view," he observed. "You can see most of the main street from here." "It helps with business," Sarah said, pouring coffee into 2 chipped cups. "I can see when potential customers are coming and going. Not that I have so many these days. Most of the wealthy ladies go to Mrs. Henderson, who has a proper shop." "Their loss." Nate accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks and sat at her small table. "I saw some of your work on those dress forms. It is beautiful. You have real skill." Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks at the compliment. "Thank you. My mother taught me. She was a wonderful seamstress. I learned everything from her." "Tell me about her," Nate said, and the genuine interest in his voice made something in Sarah's chest loosen. She found herself talking, really talking, in a way she had not done in years. She told him about her mother's gentle hands and quick smile, about her father's bookshop that had failed when the railroad bypassed their original town, forcing them to move to Abilene. She talked about the hard years after her mother's death, caring for her father as consumption slowly claimed him, and the terrifying freedom of being completely alone in the world at 20. Nate listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving her face. When she finally fell silent, embarrassed by how much she had shared, he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "You are the strongest person I have met in a long time," he said quietly. "Maybe ever." The touch of his hand sent warmth racing up her arm. Sarah looked down at their joined hands, his large and calloused, hers small and marked with needle pricks. They fit together surprisingly well. "Tell me about you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where are you from? What made you decide to go to Montana?" Nate leaned back, though he did not release her hand. "I grew up in Missouri on a small farm. My parents died of fever when I was 18 and my brother James was 20. We sold the farm and went our separate ways. I have been drifting ever since, working ranches, doing whatever needed doing. James settled in Montana 2 years ago and has been asking me to join him. I finally said yes." "Why now?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Because I was tired of drifting, tired of not belonging anywhere. I thought maybe it was time to put down roots, build something that mattered." "And now?" Sarah asked, her heart beating faster. Nate's thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand. "Now I am wondering if maybe I was heading to the wrong place. Or at least, if maybe I do not need to be in such a hurry to get there." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Sarah knew she should pull her hand away, should remind him that he had a plan, a destination, a future that did not include a seamstress in Kansas. But she could not seem to move. His touch felt too good, too right, like something she had been missing without even knowing it. A sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. Sarah jerked her hand back and stood quickly, her heart racing for an entirely different reason. "Who is it?" "Henderson from the saloon." She opened the door to find the saloon owner looking nervous and apologetic. "Miss Mitchell, I am sorry to bother you, but I thought you should know. Brennan's men have been asking questions about you around town. They want to know where you work, where you live, who your friends are. I think they mean to cause trouble." Sarah's stomach clenched. "Thank you for warning me, Mr. Henderson." "There is more." Henderson glanced at Nate, who had risen from the table and moved to stand beside Sarah. "Brennan has put out word that anyone who does business with you will lose his favor. That means a lot in this town, Miss Mitchell. I'm afraid you might find it hard to get supplies or keep customers." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. Without customers, without the ability to buy fabric and supplies, she could not work. And if she could not work, she could not pay her rent, could not eat. Brennan was trying to drive her out of town through economic pressure, and it might very well work. "I understand," she managed to say. "Thank you for telling me." Henderson left, and Sarah closed the door, leaning against it as the reality of her situation sank in. She had known there would be consequences, but this was worse than she had imagined. Brennan was not just angry. He was vindictive. "Sarah," Nate said gently. She held up a hand, fighting back tears of frustration and fear. "Please do not say anything. I made my choice, and I would make it again. I just need a moment to figure out what to do next." But Nate ignored her request. He crossed the small space and took her by the shoulders, turning her to face him. "You are not alone in this," he said firmly. "Do you hear me? You are not alone. You cannot fight my battles for me, Nate. No, but I can stand beside you while you fight them. There is a difference." His hands were warm and steady on her shoulders. "Listen to me. I have some money saved. Not a lot, but enough. If you need supplies, I can help. If customers will not come to you, maybe you can go to them. We will figure something out." "Why?" The question burst from her. "Why would you do this? You barely know me. You should be halfway to Montana by now, not tangled up in my troubles." Nate's eyes searched her face, and what she saw there made her breath catch. It was not pity or obligation. It was something deeper, something that called to the lonely parts of her soul. "Because from the moment I saw you in that saloon, standing up for someone who could not stand up for herself, I knew you were someone special," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Because in one afternoon you made me feel more alive than I have felt in years. Because I look at you and I do not see a problem to solve or a duty to fulfill. I see someone I want to know, someone I want to protect, not because you need it, but because I need to. Does that make sense?" "No," Sarah whispered, but her hands had come up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. "None of this makes sense." "Good," Nate said, and then he was kissing her. The kiss was gentle at first, a question more than a demand. But when Sarah melted into him, her hand sliding up to his shoulders, it deepened into something that took her breath away. She had been kissed before, chaste pecks from suitors her father had approved of, but nothing like this. This kiss was heat and promise, and a kind of desperate tenderness that made her feel both fragile and powerful at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Nate rested his forehead against hers. "I am not going anywhere," he said quietly. "Not unless you tell me to." Sarah's practical mind screamed that this was foolishness, that she barely knew this man, that she was letting the drama of the situation cloud her judgment. But her heart, which had been locked away for so long, was singing a different tune entirely. "Stay," she whispered. "Please stay." The days that followed were strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once. True to his word, Nate did not leave. He took a job at the livery stable, mucking stalls and tending horses, work that was beneath his skills but paid enough for a room and meals. Every evening, after Sarah finished her sewing and Nate finished at the livery, they would meet and walk through Abilene together, talking about everything and nothing. Brennan's economic sanctions took effect quickly. 2 of Sarah's regular customers sent notes canceling their orders. The fabric merchant suddenly claimed he could not extend credit. Even the grocer became cool and distant when she came to buy supplies, but Sarah refused to break. She took in mending, which paid less but was steadier work. She sold 2 of her mother's silver spoons, treasured heirlooms she had hoped never to part with. And when things got truly tight, she found a small envelope of money slipped under her door with a note in Nate's handwriting. Not charity, just a friend helping a friend. She should have been insulted, but instead she cried, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of the gesture. The next evening when Nate came to call, she threw her arms around him and held on tight, trying to convey without words what his support meant to her. Their relationship deepened with each passing day. They shared meals in her small rooms or at the modest restaurant on the edge of town whose owner did not care about Brennan's displeasure. Nate told her about his years of drifting, the ranches where he had worked, the people he had met. Sarah talked about her dreams of one day having a proper dress shop, about the designs she sketched late at night, about her hope that the world might one day be fairer to people like Mary Chen. And they kissed, long, sweet kisses that left Sarah dizzy and wanting more. Nate was always a perfect gentleman, never pushing for more than she was ready to give, but the desire that simmered between them was undeniable. Sometimes Sarah would catch him looking at her with such intensity that heat would pool in her belly, and she would have to look away, overwhelmed by feelings she barely understood. 3 weeks after the incident at the saloon, everything came to a head. Sarah was working late on a mending order when she heard shouting from the street below. She rushed to the window and saw flames leaping from the building across the way, the old warehouse that stored grain and supplies. People were running from all directions with buckets, trying to form a fire line before the flames could spread. Sarah grabbed her shawl and ran downstairs, joining the desperate effort. The heat was intense, and smoke stung her eyes, but she worked alongside her neighbors, passing buckets, trying to contain the inferno. Through the chaos, she saw Nate burst from the burning building carrying a small child, the daughter of the warehouse owner who must have been playing inside. He handed the coughing, crying girl to her mother and then ran back in. "The owner is still inside," someone shouted. Time seemed to slow. Sarah watched the door where Nate had disappeared, her heart in her throat. Seconds stretched into eternity. The roof groaned ominously, and part of it collapsed in a shower of sparks. "Nate!" Sarah screamed, starting forward, but strong hands held her back. Then she saw him, emerging from the smoke and flames with the warehouse owner slung over his shoulder. They both collapsed on the street, coughing and gasping. Sarah broke free and ran to Nate, falling to her knees beside him. "You idiot!" she sobbed, her hands running over him, checking for injuries. "You could have been killed!" Nate coughed hard, his face black with soot, but he managed a weak grin. "I am all right, just a little smoke." The doctor was called and pronounced both Nate and the warehouse owner battered, but not seriously injured. As the fire was finally brought under control, Sarah helped Nate back to her rooms, ignoring the curious stares and whispers that followed them. She did not care what people thought anymore. All that mattered was that he was alive. She cleaned the soot from his face with a damp cloth, her hands shaking with residual fear. Nate sat patiently, watching her with those steady blue eyes that seemed to see right through to her soul. "You scared me," she whispered, when she finally trusted her voice. "I'm sorry." He caught her hand, pressing it to his cheek. "But I could not let that man die, Sarah. I had to try." I know you did." She sank onto the chair beside him, suddenly exhausted. "You are a good man, Nathaniel Dalton. And you are an extraordinary woman, Sarah Mitchell." He turned his head to press a kiss to her palm. "I love you." The words hung in the air between them. Sarah's heart stopped, then started again, beating so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "You cannot," she said weakly. "We have only known each other 3 weeks." "I know what I feel," Nate said firmly. He shifted to kneel before her, taking both her hands in his. "I love your courage and your kindness. I love the way you stand up for what is right, no matter the cost. I love your quick wit and your stubbornness and the way your eyes flash when you are angry. I love how you have survived so much and remained soft enough to care about a scared girl in a saloon. I love you, Sarah, and I do not need more time to know it is true." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have loved you since you walked through those saloon doors like some kind of avenging angel." Nate surged up and kissed her, and this time there was no gentleness, only fierce, desperate passion. Sarah kissed him back with everything she had, pouring all her fear and relief and love into the embrace. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she saw her own feelings reflected in his eyes. "Marry me," Nate said. "I know it is fast, and I know you probably think I'm crazy, but marry me, Sarah. Come to Montana with me. We will build a life together, a good life. I promise I will spend every day trying to make you happy." Sarah's practical side tried to assert itself one last time. She barely knew him. They had no money. Montana was wild and dangerous. But then she looked into Nate's eyes and saw a future there, bright and full of possibility. She saw a partnership, a love that would weather any storm. She saw home. "Yes," she said, and laughed at the pure joy that spread across his face. "Yes, I will marry you." They were wed 2 days later in a simple ceremony at the small church on the edge of town. The preacher's wife and the livery owner served as witnesses. Sarah wore her best dress, a pale blue calico she had made herself, and carried a small bunch of wildflowers Nate had picked that morning. They spoke their vows with voices that shook with emotion, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Nate kissed her with such tenderness that Sarah felt tears sting her eyes. The town's reaction was mixed. Some people, those who had been disgusted by Brennan's vindictiveness, wished them well. Others, particularly those in Brennan's pocket, muttered that Sarah had trapped some poor cowboy into marriage. Sarah did not care. She had Nate, and that was all that mattered. But there was one more confrontation to endure. The day after their wedding, as they were preparing to leave Abilene, Cyrus Brennan himself appeared at Sarah's door. Nate stepped protectively in front of his new wife, but Brennan held up a hand. "I am not here to cause trouble," the rancher said, though his eyes were cold. "I am here to make something clear. You are leaving my territory, and I am glad of it. But know this, if you ever return, if you ever cause problems for me or mine again, there will be consequences. I do not forget, and I do not forgive." Sarah stepped out from behind Nate, lifting her chin. "I am not afraid of you, Mr. Brennan. I did what was right, and I would do it again. If that makes me your enemy, then so be it. But you should know that your threats do not make you powerful. They make you small." Brennan's face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, Nate spoke up, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "My wife and I are leaving, as you noted. But if you ever threaten her again, if you ever so much as speak her name with disrespect, you will answer to me. And I promise you, Mr. Brennan, I am not some girl you can push around or some shopkeeper you can intimidate. I have lived hard, and I have learned to take care of my own. Do we understand each other?" For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. Then Brennan turned on his heel and walked away without another word. Sarah released a breath she had not known she was holding and leaned against Nate's solid strength. "That man will never change or fee," she said quietly. "No," Nate agreed, "but he is not our problem anymore. We have a future to build, Mrs. Dalton." Mrs. Dalton. The name sent a thrill through Sarah that she felt all the way to her toes. They left Abilene the next morning, all of Sarah's possessions packed into the wagon Nate had purchased with the last of his savings. The journey to Montana Territory would take months, but Sarah found she did not mind. Each day on the trail brought new wonders and new challenges. They camped under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. They crossed rivers and climbed mountains and traversed endless prairies. At night in their small tent or under the open sky, Nate would hold Sarah close and tell her about the life they would build, the house they would have, the children they might one day raise. And Sarah, who had spent so many years alone and afraid, finally felt at peace. She had found not just a husband but a partner, someone who valued her strength as much as her softness, who loved her not despite her stubborn sense of justice, but because of it. They reached James Dalton's ranch in late October, as the first snow began to dust the mountains. James was a taller, broader version of Nate, with the same steady eyes and easy smile. He welcomed Sarah with genuine warmth, clearly delighted that his brother had found happiness. The ranch was rough but beautiful, nestled in a valley with mountains rising on all sides. There was a main house where James lived with his wife Elizabeth and their 2 young sons, and a smaller cabin that James had built for Nate. It was only 1 room, but it had a good stove, a sturdy bed, and windows that looked out on the most spectacular view Sarah had ever seen. "It is perfect," she breathed, standing in the doorway of their new home. "It is a start," Nate said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "We will make it ours, Sarah. We will build a life here." And they did. That first winter was hard, the snow piled high, and the cold was fierce, but Sarah had never been happier. She and Elizabeth became fast friends, and Sarah's sewing skills proved invaluable. She made clothes for the family and began taking orders from neighboring ranches. Nate worked alongside his brother, learning the rhythms of the ranch, and proved to be as skilled with cattle as he was with horses. Spring brought new life to the valley and new possibilities. With Elizabeth's help, Sarah planted a garden. She sewed curtains for their windows and braided a rag rug for the floor. Nate built her a proper sewing table and surprised her with a precious gift, a new sewing machine ordered from a catalog, one of the latest models. "Nate, we cannot afford this," Sarah had exclaimed, though her eyes shone with delight. "We can, and we did," Nate said firmly. "You are going to build a business here, Sarah, a proper one, and you need the right tools." By summer, Sarah was taking orders from as far away as the growing town of Bozeman. Women would ride for hours to have her make them a dress, drawn by her reputation for fine work and fair prices. The money she earned, combined with what Nate made from the ranch, allowed them to expand their cabin, adding a separate room that served as Sarah's workroom. But the greatest joy came that autumn when Sarah realized she was pregnant. She told Nate one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. He had been quiet for a long moment, and then he had pulled her into his arms and held her so tight she could barely breathe. "A baby," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We are going to have a baby." Their son was born the following June, during a warm spell that filled their valley with wildflowers. Sarah had a hard labor, but Elizabeth was there to help, and when she finally held her baby in her arms, all the pain was forgotten. He had Nate's dark hair and Sarah's green eyes, and they named him Thomas after Sarah's father. Nate proved to be a devoted father, patient and loving in ways that made Sarah fall even more deeply in love with him. He would walk Thomas for hours when the baby was fussy, singing old trail songs in his deep voice. He built a cradle with his own hands, carving delicate patterns into the wood. Life was not always easy. There were hard winters and dry summers, sickness and loss. Sarah miscarried a second child 2 years after Thomas was born, and the grief nearly broke her. But Nate held her through the dark days, and slowly she healed. A year later, she gave birth to twin daughters they named Grace and Hope, and then 3 years after that, another son they called Daniel. The children grew up wild and happy, running through the valley with their cousins, learning to ride almost before they could walk. Thomas inherited his mother's sense of justice and his father's steady temperament. Grace was clever and quick-witted, always asking questions. Hope was gentle and artistic, showing early promise with needle and thread. Daniel was the adventurer, forever climbing trees and exploring the mountains. Sarah's sewing business grew until she had more orders than she could handle. She took on an apprentice, a young woman from town, and together they filled their little workroom with beautiful creations. But Sarah never forgot where she had come from or the incident that had changed her life. She made a point of treating everyone who came to her with respect and fairness, regardless of their background or circumstances. Nate thrived as a rancher. He and James expanded their operation, and the Dalton Ranch became known throughout the territory for quality cattle and honest dealing. But Nate never lost his cowboy heart. He still loved being out on the range, under the open sky, and he made sure his children learned to love it too. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Nate took Sarah up into the mountains to a spot he had discovered, a meadow filled with wildflowers that overlooked the entire valley. They sat together on a blanket, watching their children play in the distance, and Nate took her hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Leaving Abilene? Marrying a drifting cowboy?" Sarah turned to look at him, at the face she had come to know better than her own. The years had added some gray to his hair and lines around his eyes, but to her he was more handsome than ever. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "You are my home, Nate. You and our children, this life we have built. I would not change any of it." "Even the hard parts?" "Especially the hard parts. They made us stronger." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I think about that day in the saloon sometimes, about how scared I was, but also how certain that I was doing the right thing, and then you walked in and everything changed." "He testified she had done what honor demanded," Nate quoted softly, remembering. "That is what they said about you around town. Some people thought you were a fool, but others understood. You did what honor demanded, Sarah, and I fell in love with you for it." Sarah smiled, her heart full. "And you stood up for me when no one else would. You could have just kept riding, but you stayed. You chose me." "I chose us," Nate corrected. "Nate." He turned to capture her face in his hands, his eyes serious. "Every day, Sarah, I choose us. I choose this life, this family, you, and I always will." They kissed there in the meadow, surrounded by wildflowers and mountains and the sound of their children's laughter drifting on the breeze. And Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. 20 years after that day in Abilene, Sarah stood on the porch of their much-expanded house and watched the sun set over the mountains. Thomas was 20 now, helping run the ranch alongside his father and uncle. The twins were 17, beautiful and capable young women who had their pick of suitors from all over the territory. Daniel, at 14, was already taller than his mother and showed every sign of becoming as skilled a horseman as his father. Nate came out to join her, sliding his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. It was a familiar gesture, comforting in its constancy. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Everything," Sarah said. "That girl I was in Abilene so alone and afraid, Mary Chen, and I hope she found safety in San Francisco, the choice I made that day not knowing it would lead to all of this." "Do you think she did? Find safety, I mean?" "I hope so. I pray so." Sarah turned in his arms to face him. "I wish I could tell her that her suffering was not meaningless, that because of what happened to her, I found you and we built this beautiful life, that some good came from all that pain." "Maybe she knows," Nate said softly. "Maybe somehow, wherever she is, she knows." They stood together in the gathering darkness, holding each other as they had for 20 years. The world had changed around them. Montana was no longer a wild territory, but a state now. Towns had grown up, and railroads had arrived. The rough edges of frontier life had been smoothed away, replaced by schools and churches and law. But some things remained constant. Justice still mattered. Honor still demanded courage. Love still transformed lives. Sarah had learned that day in the Dusty Rose Saloon that doing what was right often came with a cost. But she had also learned that the cost was worth paying because sometimes, in defending another person, you found your own salvation. She had stood up for someone weaker, and in doing so, she had found the love of her life. Nate had testified that she had done what honor demanded, and his words had not just defended her actions but had defined their future together. He had seen her at her most courageous and loved her for it, and every day since, he had proven that his love was not just words but action, commitment, partnership. Their grandchildren would someday ask about how they met, and Sarah would tell them the story. She would tell them about a young woman who was hurt, about standing up for what was right, about a cowboy who walked through saloon doors and changed everything. She would tell them that love sometimes comes when you least expect it, born from courage and honor and the simple choice to do good in a world that often does not make it easy. But mostly, she would tell them to listen to their hearts, to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves, and to never be afraid to love deeply and completely. Because that, Sarah had learned, was what life was truly about. As the stars began to emerge overhead, Nate took Sarah's hand and led her inside where their family waited. There would be dinner and conversation, laughter and stories. There would be the ordinary magic of a life well lived, of love that had endured and deepened over decades. And in the morning, there would be work to do, children to raise, a business to run, a ranch to tend. But Sarah would face it all with Nate beside her, just as she had for 20 years. They had built something beautiful from one moment of courage, one choice to stand up for what was right. She had been punished for defending another woman, but a cowboy had testified she had done what honor demanded. And from that testimony, from that moment of someone seeing her clearly and loving what he saw, an entire life had bloomed, a life rich with love and family, with purpose and meaning, with joy that far outweighed any sorrow. It was, Sarah thought, as Nate squeezed her hand and smiled at her across the dinner table surrounded by their children, more than she ever could have dreamed that hot August day in Abilene. She had risked everything for a stranger, and in return, she had gained the world. That night, as they lay in bed with moonlight streaming through the windows, Nate pulled Sarah close. "I love you," he whispered, as he did every night. "I love you too," Sarah replied, as she always did. They fell asleep in each other's arms, two souls who had found each other in the chaos of an unjust moment and built a lifetime of justice, love, and happiness together. And in the valley outside, the mountains stood eternal watch over the family that had been forged in courage and tempered by love, a testament to the enduring power of honor and the transformative nature of finding someone who truly sees you. Their story was not one of grand adventures or dramatic rescues, though it had begun that way. It was the story of everyday choices, of standing by each other through good times and bad, of building something meaningful one day at a time. It was the story of a woman who was punished for doing right and a man who testified to her honor. And most of all, it was a love story, pure and true, that began in a saloon in Kansas and bloomed into something beautiful under the vast Montana sky.